Seches Moed Katan Daf Chavav is primarily about the halachos of tearing kriya, tearing one's clothing for a period of mourning. The Gemara will begin with a list of people and instances for which one tears kriya. The Gemara will prove each one of them a source that one tears kriya and that kriya cannot be sewn up. The Gemara will then continue with a long list of other halachos. The Gemara will speak about major sugya of one who has multiple kriyas to tear. One, does he add? When does he need to tear a new kriya? What does he do if he runs out of space to tear a kriya? The Gemara will add a number of other halachos to the end of the daf. So let's begin. We have a brisa that lists the situations in which one is obligated to tear kriya, and this is a kriya which cannot be sewn up. The Gemara will give the list and then the sources. So the list is somebody who hears about the loss of a father or a mother or a rebbe, that is his rebbe who taught him the majority of his Torah knowledge. Also the loss of the nasi, who is the leader of the generation. The loss of the Av Vezdin, who was the head of the court in the area, the town, specifically to the town in which he lives. He also tears kriya for hearing bad news. The Gemara will define what kind of bad news that is. Also, if he hears someone blaspheme, someone who blesses the name, that obviously refers to someone who curses the name, he has to tear kriya for that, for hearing that, or for hearing about that as well. He also has to tear kriya if a Sefer Torah is burned and destroyed. Also, if he sees the cities of Yehuda, the Beis Hamikdash, or Yerushalayim in their destruction, he must tear kriya for that as well. The brisa ends off if he sees two of those. So if he sees the Mikdash and then he sees Yerushalayim, so he has to tear kriya for the Mikdash, and then he lengthens the rip for Yerushalayim. Now the Gemara will give sources for each one. So first of all, how do we see that one has to tear for his father, his mother, and his rebbe? So that's learned from Elisha and what he said when Eliyahu was taken to Shemayim in chariots of fire. So Elisha saw, and the pasuk describes Elisha Ra'a v'hu mitzaik Avi Rechav Yisrael Farashav, father, chariot of Israel and its riders. So Avi twice. One refers to a father, one refers to a mother. Rechav Yisrael Farashav refers to the rebbe that taught one Torah. How do you see that? So the Gemara says, like Rav Yosef translated those words, he said, Rebbe who did good for Yisrael with his prayers more than chariots and riders could possibly do. So that's a reference to the rebbe. So here you have the father, the mother, and the rebbe. Says the Gemara, how do you know that these aren't supposed to be sewn up? Because the pasuk says what Elisha did. Next it says, "V'chazik b'bgada v'yikarim l'shnayim." He grabbed his clothing and tore them into two. The Gemara says tearing is enough of an expression. Why do you have to say into two? That's to show that they stayed in two and then they could not be sewn up forever. Now, the Gemara says, Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, why did he tear kriya? Eliyahu was still alive. He had gone up to Shemayim, but he was alive still. The Gemara says, because he would never see him again, therefore it was considered to him like the dead, and he tore kriya for it. Alright, now for the Nasi and the Av Vezdin, and for Shmuel Sarais, for bad news. So the Gemara says, that's learned from when David HaMelech and his people heard about the lost war in which Shaul and Yonasan were killed. So the pasuk there describes Vayichazik David bibgada vayikarim. David grabbed his clothing and tore them. V'gam kol hanashim asher iter, all the people that were with him. Vayisbedu vayifku vayetzumu. They mourned, cried, and fasted until the evening. Al, and here you have the list. Al Shaul, Va'al Yehonasan beno, Va'al Am Hashem, Va'al Beis Yisrael ki nafel b'charv. So here you have each of these. So on Shaul was the Nasi, Yehonasan was the Av Bezdin, Am Hashem Va'al Beis Yisrael, that refers to the bad news about the loss of the war and the tragedy in which so many people were killed. Now the Gemara does not say how we know that this tear cannot be repaired, so the Rishonim explained because the same phrase appears as we found by Elisha, Vayechazak, Vayechazik b'bgada vayikroim. That's the same phrase there, and we connect the two. So now the Gemara says, how do you know that you would tear kriya, that one would tear kriya for each of these individual instances? Maybe it's only when all of them happen together. Versus because it says all about each of them. On this, that implies that each one separately was worthy of its own tear, of its own kriya. Now the Gemara says, so we said we tear kriya for shmues hara'os, So the Gemara asked, why would you tear Kriya for Shmuel's Arais? I have an incident that shows otherwise. Shmuel heard that Shavor Malka, King Shapur, had killed 12,000 Jews when he put down the rebellion at Mezigas Kesari. So Shmuel heard that and he didn't tear Kriya. So you see that just for the loss of a lot of cholesterol, one does not tear Kriya. So my answer is you would tear for the majority of the congregation. Now the Rishonim explain that does not mean more than 50% of cholesterol. Could mean more than 50% of one shevet, or more than 50% of the amount, the amount which is equal to more than 50% of any shevet that exists. Either way, it's a large number, but not as big. It wasn't large enough in the 12,000 that were killed by Shvar Malka. So the Gemara says, and you learn that from that incident that happened there. Over there, you had the war, and the majority, the number of people killed was equal to the majority of one shevet of Klal Yisrael at the time. So Gemara asks, hold on a second, you're telling me there was a story here where Shavor Malka killed the Jews, but there was a different incident in which for Malka said to Shmuel, I'm going to get credit because I never killed any Jews. So what's going on here? So Gemara says he means he didn't kill Jews for no reason. Here he was putting down a rebellion, they deserved it, but they brought it upon themselves, the Gemara says, for starting up with him, and that was not what he was referring to. So Gemara just supports that with a statement of Rav Ami that says that the sound of the harps, where people played music in joy as part of their rebellion against Shavor Malka, that sound was so loud that it broke the walls of the city of Ludkia. Okay, next the Gemara moves on to how do we see that one needs to tear Kriya for hearing Birchas Hashem. Whereas that's from an incident in which Rav Shakeh cursed the name. The Gemara doesn't quote that part of the story, but the Gemara quotes it happened next. It says, V'yava Yakim ben Chilkiah Asher al Habayis V'shivna Sofer V'yach ben Asaf Maskir Al Chizkiyo Krui Begadim. So you had the three people who heard, that was Yakim and Shivna, the scribe, and Yoach, the secretary. They all came and they reported to Chizkiah what happened, and they had their clothing torn. So you see that one must tear clothing during that time. Now the Gemara says Bryce about the halachos of tearing kriya for hearing the cursing of the name. The Gemara says that what will often happen is that somebody will need to testify. Well, it shouldn't happen too often, but when someone curses the name, he is liable to the death penalty for that, and therefore you'll have to have a testimony in court. So the witnesses will have to say over exactly what he said. They can't just say over that he cursed. They have to actually repeat it. So the judges who hear the report have to tear kriya, but the witnesses don't have to tear kriya because they already heard it and they tore kriya when they heard it the first time. Somebody asks, why don't they have to tear kriya a second time? They heard it the first time for the first report. Now they're hearing it again. So my answer is, you see from here that they don't have to, because when the three people came and reported what Rav Shakeh had said to Chizkiyahu HaMelech, it says Chizkiyahu tore kriya again. Chizkiyahu tore kriya, that is, for him this was the first time, but the three who reported it did not tear kriya again. So you see that when such an incident is being reported, those who are reporting it don't have to tear kriya again. Let's just see the pasuk that says, V'hi k'shmei hamelech Chizkiyahu v'yikares begadav. So he tore and not anybody else. Now, how do you know that in this circumstance these tears cannot be sewn up? The Gemara says from the word kriya, which appears both here and in the previous discussion, the sources we had before where it said kriya. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to how do you know that one has to tear kriya when a Sefer Torah is burned? The Gemara says it's from a pasuk discussing when Yehoiakim, King Yehoiakim, burned the Megillas Eicha that was written by Yirmiyahu. So the pasuk over there says that they came and they told Yehoiakim that Yirmiyahu had written a Megillah, and he read a couple of psukim and then he threw it in the fire. So it says, Vayhi kara Yehudi shalosh dalsos v'arba. When Yehudi, who was the one who was reading it, when he read to Yehoiakim 3 or 4 psukim, and then he yikro b'tara sofer v'hashech al eish asher halach. So then he cut it up with the razor of the scribe, and he threw it in the fire, which is in the fireplace. Gemara says, why 3, 4 psukim in? What exactly happened over there? Gemara says, this is what happened. They came to Yehoiakim and they told him Yirmiyahu, the Navi, wrote a book of Lamentations. He wrote Sefer Eicha, which the Pasuk calls Sefer Kinos. So Yehoiakim said, what does it say in there? So they started to read. It says, Eicha Yashva Vada, the lass, she sits in solitude. So they said, okay, I don't care. I'm still the king. Then they read, Bacha Yisivke Balayla, she cries at night. He said, I'm the king. Goes to Yehuda Me'oini, Yehuda has been sent into exile. He said, Adam Malka, I don't care, I'm the king. Fourth pasuk, the ways of Tzion have become empty. They become mourning. He said, Adam Malka, I'm still the king. Then they said, Hayu Tzarel Aroish, its enemies became in charge. Then he said, that's bad news. That means I'm not the king anymore. And then he said, who said this? So they read further, Ki Hashem because Hashem considered Klal Yisrael's many sins, and then he grabbed it, and he cut out all the names of Hashem, and he threw them into the fire. Now the pasuk there continues and says that afterwards, Yirmiyahu is critical of the people who were there because they didn't fear and they didn't tear their clothing. So Gemara says, so you see from here that one, if he would be present at such an incident, would be expected to tear his clothing. That would be the right thing to do. Okay, now the Gemara says, how do you know that this is because of the burning of the Torah? Papa asked Abai, maybe it's because of all the bad things that it says, because of the destruction of Yerushalayim that's listed there. So Gemara says this was all well before the destruction of Yerushalayim. Can't tear kriya on something which is predicted. You can only tear kriya on something which actually happens. Okay, now the Gemara says further, somebody that Rav Chalbo says, and then Rav Huna, somebody who sees a Sefer Torah get torn has to tear kriya twice for two different tragedies. One is the destruction of the klaf, destruction of the body of the Sefer Torah. The other one is for the words which are torn. Where do you see that? The Gemara quotes a pasuk, Acharei Sraf HaMelech Es HaMegillah Ve'es HaDvarim. It says he tore the Megillah and he tore the Dvarim. He tore the scroll and the words. Those two things, each separately, would require a kriya. Whereas the story that Rabbi Abba and Rav Huna Bar Chia were sitting in front of Rabbi Abba, he needed to use the restroom, so he got up, he took off his tefillin, he put it down on the couch, and along came an ostrich and tried to eat the tefillin. So he was able to successfully save the tefillin, but he said, had that ostrich managed to eat my tefillin, I would have to tear two kriyas, one for the words and one for the scrolls, the cloth which is inside the tefillin. So Gemara says that they weren't so sure about that halacha. They said to him, how do you know? A similar incident happened with me. One of them spoke and said, happened with me. And I went before Rav Masna, and he didn't know whether or not I had to actually tear two kriyas. I went before Rav Yehuda, and he said, in the name of Shmuel, one does not have to tear kriya for an accidental destruction of a Sefer Torah. One has to tear kriya for when a Sefer Torah is destroyed by force. That is, he cannot have prevented it. It was time to prevent it, but he could not have prevented it. When an accident happens where something destroys it, and nothing was blocking him physically, there wasn't anything that was forcing him by strength and by abuse from saving the Torah. It was just that he didn't have time. He wasn't able to save it because it happened too fast. So a situation like that, one would not have to tear kriya. It's only similar to the case of Yehoiakim, where it was by strength that one could not save it. Okay, now the Gemara discusses the cities of Yehuda, where we said you have to tear kriya. The Gemara says that comes from the pasuk describing when people came to bring karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash and they found it destroyed, so they ripped their clothing. And over there it says Vayivayu Anashim Mishchem, Mishilo, Mishomron. People came from Shechem, Shchelo, and Shomron. Shmona Mish 50 people, Mugalachi Zakan, shaved beards, Kurei Begadim, torn clothing, Umizgodidim, and ripped flesh. And Minchol Biyadam, they had brought karbanos in their hands, Lahavi Beis Hashem. They wanted to bring karbanos, and they came there and they found that it was destroyed. So there you see that one must tear kriya on that. Now the Gemara quotes Rav Chabba, name of Ula Bira, name of Rav Elazar, that there is something that one should say when he tears kriya for Yerushalayim, cities of Yehuda, and the Beis Hamikdash. If he sees cities of Yehuda, he should say, Ari Kachecha Hayu Midbar. Your holy cities became the desert, and he should tear. He sees Yerushalayim destroyed, he should say, Tzion, Midbar, Haisa, Yerushalayim, Shmama. That Tzion became a desert, and Yerushalayim is desolate, and then he should tear. When he sees the Beis Hamikdash destroyed, he should say, Beis Kashenu v'Teferatenu Asher Halalucha v'Iseinu Hayal Seifas Eish Shachal Machmadenu Hayal Acharava, and then he should tear. So he should say, our holy house and our glory that our fathers praised you became burned in fire, and all our precious things became destroyed, and that's when he tears. Okay. Now there was a kasha on what we had seen in the Brisa, that one should tear for the Beis Hamikdash, and then when he sees the cities of Yerushalayim, he should add to the tear. So where it says, we have a different Brisa that says that, first of all, it says one who sees the destruction must tear, one who heard about the destruction in real time must tear. As far as one who sees, when he approaches has to do a separate tear, one for the Beis Hamikdash, one for Yerushalayim. So that contradicts ours. It says he just widens and lengthens the tear. Of course, it depends which one he sees first. If he first sees the destruction of Yerushalayim and then the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, that requires a new tear. If he first sees the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, that is, he entered Yerushalayim in a closed carriage, and then he only sees Yerushalayim after he sees the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and after he tore on that already, so he tore already for the more significant tear, then he only widens the tear, doesn't have to make a new tear. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the halacha. We've seen that they cannot be fixed up, sewn up in the proper, complete way that is mended in the efficient manner. So Gemara says there are poor types of fixings which one is allowed to do. He's allowed to do shololon, mololon, loktan, and kimin sulama. So what are these things? So shololon is uneven stitches. We've discussed earlier in the Masechta. Mololon means that he folds them and sews down the fold. Loktan means that he makes a number of different folds and squeezes them together and folds that down with a stitch or two. And like ladders means he makes widely spaced stitches along the tear so that it looks like rungs of a ladder. Now what is forbidden is what's called achosan. Achosan is a proper tearing where one pulls the edges together and sews them on the inside so that you don't see the tears, you don't see the torn edges, you just have a clean seam that's visible from the outside. Gemara says that's the type of sewing that's called Ichui Alexandri. That's Alexandrian sewing, and that's the only thing that's forbidden. Alright, now the Gemara quotes a Brisa that has a similar halacha. The Brisa says if somebody wants to tear clothing that was already torn out of Avelis and sewn up, so it depends how good the sewing was, whether or not this counts as a new tear. If it was just a shalal or a malal, as we discussed earlier, those don't really count as fixing, and therefore another tear is not considered he hasn't fulfilled the obligation to tear by re-tearing it because it was never really fixed. Same applies to sulamos when he has where it just looks like a ladder. However, if ichui was done, and that's proper sewing, as Rav Chisda said, ichui Alexandrian sewing, then that is considered to be a proper sewing, and if somebody tears that on the same spot, that would be okay. Okay, now the Gemara says one is permitted to turn the clothing upside down. That is, he sews up the bottom and makes a head hole at the bottom and makes a regular hole at the top, and he wears it upside down. So now the tear is at the bottom. He's allowed to do that, and in a case like that, he's even allowed to sew it up. Now Shimon ben Elazar says he's not allowed to sew it up. He can do that, but he cannot sew it up. The next halacha, if somebody wants to sell clothing with a tear in it that can't be sewn up, he's allowed to. But just like he couldn't sew it, the purchaser can't sew it, and therefore the seller must tell him, you can't sew this tear. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the halachos of when one adds to a tear that already exists. That could be because he's adding to a tear he made for Yerushalayim. He's adding a tear for, if he made a tear for the Beis Hamikdash, and he's adding to that tear when he sees Yerushalayim, or when someone hears about the loss of a relative, tears, and then he gets another loss, then he could add to that tear. So how does this adding to the tear work? So the question of the Brisa is, how big is the original tear and how big is the adding? So you have two opinions, then a third that takes one of each. So the first opinion is that the original tear has to be a tefach and the addition has to be 3 fingers. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says the original tear has to be 3 fingers and the addition could be any size. Rabbi Yossi says the original tear has to be a tefach and the addition could be any size. So he goes like Rabbi Meir in the size of the original tear and like Rabbi Yehuda in the size of the addition. Ula says that's the halacha. We pass like Rabbi Yossi against Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now the Gemara discusses if one is allowed to add to the tear that's made for a father or mother. So the Gemara quotes a Brisa. There's going to be 2 opinions here. The first one says yes, and therefore it plays out as follows. If somebody loses his father or his mother and he tears, and then he loses a son, so he can sew up the bottom of the tear. That's the part that was added for the son. He can't sew up the top of the tear. So you see he can add to the existing tear, and then each part has its regular halachos. The one that was torn for the parent cannot be sewn up. The one that was torn for another relative can be sewn up. Now if he first loses a son and then a father, so again he can add to the original tear, and here the first part he can sew up, and the latter part, which would be lower, he's not allowed to sew up. Now, the Gemara brings, if somebody loses a father, a mother, a brother, and a sister, he only tears once for all of them. He hears about all the losses at once, he tears one time for each of them. Okay, now Rabbi Yehuda ben Seira argues on this entire thing, and he says you got to do separate tears for a parent and for other relatives. You cannot have one tear go for all of them if he hears about them all at once, and he cannot add to a tear that was made for a father he can add to that for another relative, and he can add to that made for another relative for a father or for a mother. What's the reason? So you can't add to a tear that's made for a parent, because that tear is generally a big, long, serious tear, and it won't be recognizable that there's two tears here. It just looks like one very large tear for the parent. You also cannot add a tear that was made for another relative to do one for the parent, because that's not respectful to the parent. The honor of the parent demands a separate tear just for him. And what's the halacha here? So Shmuel says the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Seira, that you have to do a separate tear. The Gemara questions that. Shmuel says that you always go leniently in Hilchas Avelos. The Gemara says we distinguish between the halachas of Avelos and the halacha of tearing Kriya. Not the same thing. Tearing Kriya, one should at times rule strictly. Tearing is not the same as halachas of Avelos, and Avelos one always goes leniently. Alright, now how far can you keep adding to a tear? Let's say somebody has a lot of tragedies happening one after the other. How far is he allowed to keep adding? And when does he have to start a new tear? So the Gemara quotes in Machlokas. First opinion is that until it reaches the belly button. Second opinion is until it reaches the heart. Now, the Gemara says there's no proof for that, but there is an indication. Like it says, V'kiru levavchem al bigdeichem, tear your hearts on your clothing. V'el bigdeichem, to your clothing. Now, what if one runs out of space? He reaches the belly button, so he has to start a new tear. This tear has to be at least 3 fingers away, parallel to the original tear. If the entire front of his shirt is filled with tears, turn the shirt around backwards and start tearing the other side. If both sides are full of tears, he can turn the shirt upside down, wear it upside down, and start tearing the bottom. Generally, somebody who tears the bottom does not count as tearing. One who tears on the sides does not count as a tearing. It's got to be front or back. The only situation in which one tears at the bottom is a Kohen Gadol who's not allowed to tear, but he wants to do a symbolic tear. He's allowed to tear from the bottom because that doesn't count as a tear. It doesn't violate the Isser of tearing, so that he's allowed to do. And now the Gemara has a machlokes when one is obligated to do another tear and when one can just widen the tear. Most of the machlokes between Rav Mas and Mar Ukva, one the name of Shmuel's father, one the name of Levi. According to one, if he hears about the second loss during the Shiva of the first loss, he's got to do a new tear. According to the other, if he hears during the Shloshim, he has to do a new tear. If he hears afterwards, it will be enough to just widen the original tear. Now, the Gemara understands when the time for the original tear has been up, when that's up, then you could just widen the tear and it counts as a new tear. If, however, the original obligation to tear still exists, or during the time when it can't be fixed, then he has to do a new tear. It doesn't help to just widen it. So Gemara has a kasha on each of them. The Gemara says, according to the one who says that it goes by Shiva, that means that he's understanding that we're considering the tear to be in force as long as it can't be sewn up at all, even with a poor sewing. That's during Shiva. A tear can be sewn up after Shiva in a poor manner, and it can be fixed properly after 30 days. So the one who says that it's until that it's the entire Shiva, he has to make a new tear, it's not enough to widen it, is understanding that the obligation for the first tear exists as long as it can't be sewn up, even with poor sewing. The Gemara asks, but a woman's allowed to sew it up right away. So if this would be the halacha, a woman should be allowed to just widen the tear, because for her, she's allowed to sew up the tear right away, even during Shiva. Why doesn't he make that distinction? So the Gemara answers, for the woman, it doesn't mean that the original tear is not considered to be in force during Shiva. The reason she's allowed to sew it up is because it's not respectful, it's not kavod, it's sneers for her to walk around with a torn shirt. That's why she can sew it up right away. But the halacha that the tear is still supposed to be existing for the entire 7 days applies to her as well. Now the Gemara has a kasha in the other opinion that it's during Shloshim. The Gemara says that the reason for that is because the entire Shloshim one is not allowed to sew it up in proper stitching. So he's understanding that the tear has to remain in force until the time when one's allowed to sew it up properly. Then that tear is over and he could just widen the tear and that's be considered another tear. So Gemara asks, if that's true, then it should make a difference whether it was a tear for a father or mother or for a different relative, because a tear is only allowed to be fixed after Shloshim if it's a tear for another relative. If it's a tear for a father or the mother, it can't be fixed ever. If that's the situation, then he should not be allowed to widen it. It should be considered like it's not fixable. Someone says no. Again, that's not a halacha of the tear. The tear is over after 30 days. That's a special halacha out of respect for the parent. He shouldn't fix it up ever. But the tear itself has ended after 30 days. Never, if he just widens it, it's enough. Now, that obviously does not go like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Seira, which we saw earlier. Okay. Now the Gemara discusses somebody who goes to a funeral with clothing torn already. So Gemara says he's stealing from the living and stealing from the dead. Stealing from the living because he's making them think he tore for this person. Stealing from the dead because he's not going to be able to tear for this person. And he's showing as if he did, and therefore it's what's called Genevas Hadas, stealing the understanding. Now what happens if somebody has borrowed clothing on? So Shimon ben Gamliel says somebody can say to his friend, lend me your clothing, I'm going to visit my father who is ill. If you say that and then the person lends it anyway, that means he's understanding that it may be torn and he's giving permission. So the person can then take it, go visit his father, and if he finds that he died, he can tear it. He sews it up right away in proper stitching, does not have to wait because it's not his, and he has to pay for the devaluing of the clothing. He's not allowed to blame it on the fact that the person gave him permission. Now, if he didn't notify him that he's going to visit his father who's ill, then he has no implicit permission to tear it, and he may not tear it at all. He has to wait until he gets his own clothing on and tear it then. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a brisa, somebody who is sick and lost a relative, one should not notify him, and one should make sure that he doesn't find out, because that may cause his illness to get worse. So one doesn't tell him about it, one does not appear in front of him in torn clothing, and one does not allow women to lament in front of him. As far as a child who lost a relative, he is not obligated in any of the halachos of Avelos. There is no chinuch for Avelos. However, we do tear his clothing as a sign of mourning for others, to arouse others to weep. There's something particularly heart-wrenching about seeing a child with torn clothing. Now the Gemara says that somebody should tear for his father-in-law or mother-in-law out of respect for his wife. Next halacha, the Gemara says that it says in Avel Rabasi, which is Maseches Machos, that an Avel is not allowed to hold a child in his lap because that brings him to laughter, and then he'll appear degraded before everyone else who's there. Okay, the Gemara refers back to our Mishnah. In the Mishnah we'd seen the halacha that if somebody serves the mourner's meal, then the mourner, we know, sits on a low surface. He turns the bed over. The one who's coming to comfort him, he sits on a high surface. So the Gemara says, the brisa that says that if he's particularly close to the mourner, then he can sit on a low surface. If not, then he should sit on a high surface. The Gemara says that Rava lost someone, and he was visited by Abba Bar Marta, who was also known as Abba Bar Yumi, and Rava stood the bed up for him, so he should sit on a high surface, meaning that the visitor should sit on a high surface. So he turned it over to sit on a low surface. Rava did not feel that that was appropriate. He didn't feel like that person was close enough to him, and therefore he said, this Tzorva Rabbanan, this young Talmid Chacham, does not seem to have any sense. Next, halacha the Markot Tzarbais says somebody who's traveling and he hears about a loss. The Rashi understands he's traveling on a business trip, so he should minimize his business if he can. If not, he can keep rolling together with those who are doing the business. Does not have to sustain a loss for the sake of the mourning.